And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, I should like to begin by stating that the imposition on the General Assembly of a discussion, para 63 on the agenda, point 63 on the agenda, has nothing to do with reality, not even anything to do with virtual reality. Furthermore, this is surrealistic. In Ukraine, there are no temporary occupied territories. If the Ukrainian delegation means Crimea, then that is a constituent territory of the Russian Federation, which became that in 2014 following a referendum. During this referendum, 96.77% of voters with 83.1% voter turnout voted in favor of reunification of the peninsula with the Russian Federation. If we are talking about Donbass, then on Donbass, there is a civilian conflict underway between the Kiev authorities and the citizens of Ukraine who refuse to accept and acknowledge the coup in Ukraine in 2014. For 6 years, the Ukrainian authorities, first the old authorities, now the new authorities, have been exploiting a very convenient legend, convenient to themselves. They assert there is no civilian conflict, there is an aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. This is a convenient position. It enables them to shirk implementation of the Minsk Agreement. It enables them to portray themselves not as the aggressor, as a victim, not as an aggressor, which in 2014 brought its army into nationalist battalions in order to quell the protests in Donbass. And this is all the more convenient, given that this position enjoys the support of the Western sponsors of Kiev, former guarantors of the agreement on the settlement of the crisis in February 2014. This agreement was trampled upon immediately, and those Western sponsors gave Kiev a carte blanche to sabotage the Minsk agreements and a license to any lies. Everything is hidden. Today there was a mention about the incident in Golubovsk, where a Ukrainian subversive armed group attempted to enter the territory under the control of the rebels. As a result, there were hostilities during which a Ukrainian service personnel died. The Ukrainian armed forces respond with mortar fire of 50 shells targeting residential areas. And the day after, in media from abroad, not to mention Ukrainian ones, there are reports DPR, LPR violated the ceasefire on the 5th anniversary of the signing. Do you know where the body of the unfortunate 22-year-old Ukrainian soldier who was sent to fight against his people? With the rebels. Does this jibe with the version that they began the offensive and just yesterday they didn't even deign to pick up that body? 6 years ago, we all bore witness to the tragedy in the center of Kiev. The culmination of this was the brutal coup, which led to the cessation of Crimea and the ongoing protracted conflict in Donbass. A large-scale systemic crisis is now besetting the country, and this crisis was largely triggered by and is proactively supported by Western states, above all the United States of America. Everything that transpired subsequently in Ukraine cannot be characterized as anything but endless political chaos, legal nihilism, and rampant ultranationalism. At the same time, there were proactive attempts to conceal the truth, to conceal the real facts behind baseless accusations. Today, the inconvenient truth, for Kiev, is now coming to light. The assessment of the actions was provided by the Ukrainian voters, voting a mistrust for the previous government and voting for change for the future. The new leadership was able to grasp the sentiment in the country, and for the moment it is unable to provide an alternative, effectively pursuing the doomed policy of its predecessors. The starting point of any discussion at the United Nations for the resolution in Ukraine is the resolution adopted 5 years ago at the Security Council, 2202, as the sole international legal bedrock for the international community's efforts, the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements, the maneuvers, such as today's maneuver, which have been undertaken by the Ukrainian delegation, unfortunately, attests to an unwillingness to acknowledge this. It was patently clear during Tuesday's meeting of the Security Council to commemorate the 5th anniversary of Resolution 2202. The linchpin for settling any conflict is a dialogue among the belligerents. This is something which we always call for ubiquitously in Syria, Libya, Yemen, Afghanistan, and in other areas. However, there is no need to engage in dialogue with Donbass, for according to one of the founders of the Minsk agreements and the Normandy format, a permanent representative of German, Mr. Heusgen, they are merely Russian puppets, so there's no need to engage in discussion with them. Instead, we hear the hackneyed mantra about Russian aggression and that Minsk is not being complied with by Russia, even though we are not mentioned there. This is a reckless approach to the Minsk agreements. And that being the case, it is difficult to consider the possibility of implementing the outcomes of the December summit in Paris and the relevant other prospects. If we are to broaden our perspective, then until there's an acknowledgement of the real root causes of the problems in Ukraine, there will be no headway towards a settlement. Nothing will change so long as Kiev fails to take into account the interest of the vastly overwhelming population of the country, not just the residents of Donbass. Following the anti-constitutional coup 6 years ago, the people of the East and Crimea made it clear that they do not support the new regime, which toppled everything in the country. And if in any civilized country, the authorities were to sit down at a negotiating table, then Maidan decided to introduce friendship trains, punitive trains with thugs, and armies were deployed, and bombs and shells, and that is a root problem. Naturally, the peoples seek to protect their lives and values. The Crimeans decided to return to their homeland. A referendum was held, and in February 2015, the Minsk package of agreements was signed, which the Russian Federation and OSCE attested to. However, today we see that Ukraine, instead of restoring the trust of millions of its citizens, is doing precisely the opposite. Rubber stamping laws, blatantly discriminating against people in religious, cultural, economic, and religious rights, imposing censorship and prohibitions on the use of their mother tongue. This has nothing to do with respect for peoples, their views, their values, what the United Nations calls inclusivity. Today we've heard about this not just from us, but also from the foreign minister of Hungary, Mr. Siak. And when we hear tall tales that the Russian Federation is violating something, which that Kiev doesn't have to comply with its pledges to its own people, we perfectly understand that the only purpose is to expand their discriminatory policy specifically to the Donbass. And the residents of the region, of these regions, understand this just as well as we do, which is why they're doing everything possible to repel this. It is clear to us that Kiev's fear of compliance with its Minsk obligations and to conduct elections, above all, are due to the fact that the people are likely to vote for those who protected the Ukrainian people from the Ukrainian army, its bullets and shells. And this is a democracy that Maidan people do not wish to play. And hence the discussions on immediate restoration of control over the border and the refusal of granting amnesty. Who are you trying to lie to? These are visible lies. Do you think that it is unclear that if the rebels surrender, then Donetsk and Lugansk, the 5 years events 5 years ago will be forgotten when in the trade union building dozens were burned alive in support for daring not to support the Maidan, and there's complete impunity for that. There is a quelling of any dissent, intervention in media outlets. There are raids in editorial offices of media outlets. International human rights organizations such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Freedom House explicitly point to the fact that radical groups in the country cloak themselves in patriotic rhetoric and thereby enjoy complete impunity. The policy of glorification of Nazism is long now a norm in Ukraine. During an 18 February Security Council meeting, the Ukrainian representative said that on 9 May in Moscow, Stalin's portraits will be held aloft. If he was talking about the military parade, then this is a parade of the units of armed forces and equipment. If he was talking about the immortal regiment marches occurring in Moscow and cities throughout the Russian and abroad, then people there hold aloft portraits of their family members, participants in the Great Patriotic War, and of course there will be Ukrainians there too. I will hold, and I do hold aloft a portrait of my father, who fought in 1941 as a volunteer in Leningrad and ended in 1945 in Berlin. It is possible that Stalin's portrait will be there because he is and was the main commander and the victor. But I'm certain that the marches in Moscow will not include portraits of Bandera and Shuhevich, Nazi henchmen and collaborationists, the heroes of modern-day Ukraine. At the same time, on 9 May in Moscow, there will be people going out with portraits of their relatives, victors who liberated Europe from fascism. And unfortunately, in Kiev, there will be collaborators being glorified. And it's no secret that the delegation of your country annually votes against this General Assembly resolution glorifying Nazism. Today in Ukraine, at the state level, there is a 115th anniversary commemoration of the writer Ulas Samuchok, who's called the Ukrainian Homer in Ukraine. Listen to a quote from this Ukrainian Homer. Analyzing Hitler's speech, he said, "This is the invincible moral and spiritual power which for centuries have forged and fortified the people. These are the numerous generations of the immortal bearers of the creative spirit of the people who advance today as with historic events under the leadership of the great leader, the Führer of the great Germany, with his valiant soldiers brought us victory. Do not forget this. We thank the Führer Adolf Hitler and the victorious German soldiers laboring for our land." And this is what the Donbass have been repelling. They do not wish to shout Bandera slogans glorifying Bandera, and they do not wish to bow before those kinds of heroes. They want to pay tribute to the memory of those who liberated them, not those who cooperated with the fascists and killed thousands of Jews, Russians, Ukrainians, and Poles. Let them have the right themselves to choose for themselves their language, as is done throughout the civilized world. This is the essence of the Minsk package measures, sir, turning once again to attempts to impose upon the General Assembly a discussion of Crimea. If the decision for the Republic of Crimea to join the Russian Federation is something some do not wish to acknowledge, then this is manifest contempt in the face of 2.5 million Crimeans. To us, that is unacceptable. For this reason, the Russian Federation respects and protects the expression of popular will of the residents of the Crimea, which led to Maidan's leaders' acts. The real violations of human rights are those who imposed visa restrictions for Crimeans, restricting their freedom of movement, those imposing sanctions. You've decided to punish them for selecting the Russian Federation. Why do you think that you can instruct Crimeans and other Russians what they can do? Those who wish to travel to see that the situation in peninsula in the peninsula is far from what some in Kiev wish to present it, then you can see for yourselves. Come join the 7 million tourists and see for yourselves the response there. I'm sure that you will be surprised by the responses. Don't believe in cheap propaganda. See for yourselves, hear for yourselves. I hope that there will be a rightful assessment for that people will see Ukraine's attempt to politicize the meeting. Today is a stark example of this situation. Rather than condoning provocation by Kiev authorities, let us rather focus on finally compelling Ukraine to take into account the views and the voices of their fellow nationals residing in the east of the country. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation